This week we're talking about David Cronenberg. So be afraid. Be very afraid. Or get naked and have lunch. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. It's a new introduction video. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And it gives you a pretty good idea of what the horror movie syllabus is all about. In short, we take a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. And the subgenre that we're talking about today is one that I'm pretty hyped for. I'm pretty excited about this, and that's David Cronenberg films. I'm hyped for this because I love me some David Cronenberg, but that has also created some challenges because this subgenre appears on our newly created horror movie supplement, which is an additional 100 subgenres to the original horror movie syllabus's 100 subgenres. And in that original horror movie syllabus subgenre list, I used a bunch of David Cronenberg movies because I like David Cronenberg. And so the rules of the horror movie syllabus is you can only use a movie once. So when I finally decided to go ahead and give Cronenberg his own subgenre, I've already used some of the best stuff. So I've already used The Fly, so we won't really be talking about The Fly here, even though it's probably my favorite Cronenberg film. And yeah, I know that's kind of a basic choice, but it's a great movie. What can I say? I mean, but we're not going to be talking about Videodrome or Existenz or The Dead Zone because we already talked about those, which leaves me with like one hand tied behind my back when it comes to picking David Cronenberg movies for this subgenre. But that's okay because there's still a lot of really great stuff to talk about. If you're unfamiliar with David Cronenberg, he is a Canadian director. He's still active, and he's known for basically body horror. He's widely considered to be one of the originators of body horror type movies, and his body horror is somewhat, I feel, specific to him because it's not just gore, it's not just gross things, but it's a wildly imaginative combinations of physiological and technological stuff to create something kind of wholly new, something kind of evolved, or radically different and imaginative, the kind of stuff you'd see in anime, frankly. And it's often tied to some sort of sexual or psychosexual angle, which again, maybe kind of ties into anime a little bit. But it's definitely very Cronenberg. It's got a certain like feel or vibe or signature to it that is distinct and is a little bit different from the other types of body horror that we explored in our body horror subgenre, which kind of ironically, I guess, didn't include any Cronenberg. And I think I mentioned that in that video, but I'm mentioning it again here. And I think it's because I probably knew at that time that I wanted to do this. I wanted to have a video just for Cronenberg. And if I used Cronenberg in the body horror subgenre video, I wouldn't have as many things to talk about as I wanted to talk about here. And honestly, I probably would have, missed out on a lot of other really great movies. So, the body horror subgenre video talks about a lot of really cool body horror stuff, and I love it. But it's not Cronenberg style body horror. Like his body horror is just, it's both like disgusting and fascinating and erotic all at the same time, which is really bizarre, really a strange kind of combination to make. But he pulls it off. It's horrifying and revolting, but also alluring and intriguing. And it's wholly Cronenberg. It's just him. It's his thing, and I love it. I'm not sure if there's a Cronenberg movie I dislike. Have I seen all of them? No, I don't think so. But I've seen all the body horror stuff. And I don't think there's one that I dislike. There's just gradations of how much I like them. And the ones that I like the most are ones that I probably already put on the syllabus, frankly. But that isn't to say that the ones we're going to talk about today are not good or not as good, because they're definitely worth talking about. They're definitely fascinating and interesting. And they're ones that I'm just a big fan, and I like a lot of his stuff. And so there's no downside to these movies. I'm a fan of all of these. Now, are they all horror? Well, that's a big debate when it comes to Cronenberg. Like David Lynch, for example, there's some debate as to whether or not you'd call these horror movies in the truest traditional sense. But you know me, I don't get too hung up on that. I call everything horror, although even Cronenberg would probably admit that it's more sci-fi and psychological drama than horror. But You know what? Who cares? We want to talk Cronenberg. We're going to talk Cronenberg. And honestly, every movie that we talk about today has at least one horrifying or horrific thing in it. So let's go ahead and get into these movies because I'm excited to talk about them. We're going to organize them in undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate like we always do. But in this case, we're just going to go chronological just to keep it simple. We're going to put them in chronological order. So let's go ahead and start exploring these David Cronenberg body horror films. The first Cronenberg movie we're looking at today is Rabid. And Rabid came out in 1977 and is an early work of Cronenberg's. It's not his first film, but it is one of his earliest actual bona fide movies. And you know, to some degree, it probably shows a little bit, but it really does set the stage for what Cronenberg's going to be all about when it comes to body horror. It really is a great example or a great entry point into talking about Cronenberg and what his whole aesthetic, his whole vibe actually is. And that's why I'm putting it on here on the syllabus, and why it's a great one to start off with, and a great reason to go chronologically, frankly. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a young woman who gets into a motorcycle accident and is severely injured, and in an effort to help save her, the doctors try a new experimental treatment that has some frankly unintended side effects, as it gives her a craving for human blood and also modifies her body in a way that creates an organic stinger that comes out of her armpit that sucks the blood out of people. That's maybe the best way I could describe it or explain it, because it kind of defies explanation and description. But we're going to get into that in just a few minutes here. But the movie is an interesting take on vampirism, although I don't usually hear it explained that way, because it's really kind of thought of more as an infection film, which is kind of hinted at by the title and by the plot of the movie, frankly. As the woman goes out into the world and starts, attacking people, they become infected and they become like her, and it all kind of starts to spread and becomes this epidemic or pandemic, if you will, of people going around attacking people and sucking blood. But it's not really kind of like vampirism, at least not in the traditional vampire sense that you would think. It really is more monstrous than that, more imaginative than that, and just very, very strange. In this movie, Cronenberg has come up with this really unique and bizarre and off-putting method by which somebody gets attacked with this. There's no other way to put this. Like a penis that comes out of the arm, out of the armpit, and attacks people. It's as disgusting as it sounds, frankly. And you probably haven't seen anything like it before, and that's really kind of one of Cronenberg's trademarks, is he just comes up with stuff that you just haven't seen before, and it's wildly effective. I mean, for practical effects, it looks really good, even though it's ages ago, decades ago. It still holds up rather well for the most part. And the movie, like I said, it shows a little bit that it's early Cronenberg work, because it's not super slick. It's a little bit low budget. It looks a little bit low budget. It's not really super clean and sharp and pretty, but that actually kind of adds to the whole movie a little bit, as this outbreak of what they call rabies in the movie is kind of spreading. It feels not quite documentarian, but a little bit more so with the kind of the lower production value. It really kind of gives it a realism that works for the movie really, really well. Another thing that works really well for the movie is Marilyn Chambers as the main girl. Marilyn Chambers, who at the time in the 70s was a rather well-known pornographic actress, adult film star. And so using her here in a more mainstream and non-pornographic role really is an interesting choice. And I think when that was kind of put upon Cronenberg to try to get kind of a name to sell the movie a little bit more. From what I understand, he wanted Sissy Spacek in the role, who actually would have been quite good, but he was not Canadian. They were setting the movie in Canada, and Sissy Spacek, probably couldn't have convinced anybody she wasn't from Texas. So they went with Marilyn Chambers, and it winds up being a really great decision, because she gives an excellent performance, one that from her other work you probably wouldn't expect from her, but she's really, really good in this movie. At least I think so. It's a surprise to me because of her background, that she gives a performance that I feel is somewhat nuanced, because she is playing an average ordinary girl, and then when she gets this this surgery and becomes this predator, for lack of a better word. She winds up, kind of turning up the sex appeal and stuff like that as she kind of goes out hunting. And that's where you see the Marilyn Chambers that you maybe expect. But then there's also this vulnerability to her and this, innocent victim aspect to it that she still retains throughout the movie. It's a really interesting performance that she pulls off really well. And you wind up sympathizing with her throughout the movie. And I think that's important because it would be very easy to kind of just turn her into the villain of the movie. And yet she doesn't. She doesn't wind up being the villain. She still winds up being kind of a tragic figure. And I really like that. Marilyn Chambers winds up making this movie better with her performance. But acting aside, the real centerpiece for the movie is the gore, the body horror, the gore, the concept of it. It's really striking. It really is something else, and I absolutely love it. It's just, again, it shows off the imagination of David Cronenberg. He is definitely doing something different that nobody else is thinking about. The stuff of nightmares, and it's very, very effective, very, very cool, very interesting, and it was very off-putting to critics at the time. I think that it's something that has kind of in retrospect is kind of seen as something of a cult classic and everything, but at the time I think people were just very off-put by how gross it was, frankly, and it's kind of sending this bizarre message too of like sexuality and science and stuff like that I don't know how it was received back then, and even now it's maybe not the clearest of messages, but it's interesting because I feel like this movie maybe hits a little bit better in a post-pandemic world. The public reaction to this infection spreading and the media response to it and the way that people act and react to it is interesting in a post-pandemic world where we've seen in real life how people react to an infection, to a disease that's spreading. So I think that it kind of hits in a way now that is different than it did in the 70s. And I think it kind of maybe speaks better now than it did. So it's a movie that I think resonates even to this day, which is pretty neat. But it's not even the first outbreak or infection movie that Cronenberg had even done. I mean, he had already done Shivers at this point, which is remarkably similar to this movie in some ways. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later, hint, hint. But it's interesting that he kind of had this idea and he kind of was dwelling on it. And then here we are decades later, and it has so much more meaning. I just find that really fascinating. Now, there was a remake done a while back by the Saska sisters, who we've talked about on the channel, and who have their own body horror, niche that they like to fill. And I like this movie. It is kind of a polarizing movie. I think a lot of people don't really love it. Critically, it's not as well received as the original, and big surprise. But I like it. I think they do a pretty good job of updating it and giving it a slightly different spin while still staying fairly true to the original. So I'm a fan of it, but I know that that's kind of a polarizing opinion. Not everybody likes the remake of it, but the original has kind of stood its ground as an early Cronenberg classic, or cult classic at least, and it does seem to really resonate now. Early, filmmaking foibles aside, budget issues aside, it really does still work very well on its own. You don't really need a remake because the original holds up pretty darn well. Let me know if you agree with that, because I am a fan of Rabbit. I do like it quite a bit. And I know that some people, they're kind of lukewarm about it, but I do think it has endured as a cult classic for a reason. So if you have a different opinion, of course, share in the comments below. But if you haven't seen Rabbit, it's a great place to start for your Cronenberg education. The next Cronenberg movie we're talking about is The Brood. The Brood came out in 1979 and is kind of a favorite of mine, one of the Cronenberg favorites. It's the one that I wanted most to put on the horror movie syllabus and didn't manage to fit in somewhere else. And that kind of pained me, but then I kind of felt like maybe I'll do a Cronenberg video anyways. And that is probably the biggest reason why we're having this video, is because I wanted to talk a little bit about The Brood, because it's absolutely fantastic. And it is one of my favorites that I haven't already talked about before, frankly. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a married couple that have gone through a divorce, and they are going through a divorce, and the wife is going through kind of an experimental therapy with this controversial therapist who has these methods that are kind of out there, kind of weird, and they kind of are secluded in the woods in this facility. And the husband doesn't really know what's going on, but they have a daughter together, and the daughter is starting to exhibit some signs of potential abuse, which has got the husband kind of all worked up, and he really wants to find out what's going on with his wife in this therapy. And hijinks start to abound, including some crazy dwarf-like killer children stuff. I don't know, we're going to get into it a little bit, but I don't want to spoil it for anybody in case you haven't seen it. But The Brood is a lot of fun. And what's interesting about it is that, by Cronenberg's own admission, this movie is more serious and less funny than his other work. And I never really thought about that too much because I don't necessarily think of his work as out and out funny. It's not horror comedy. It's not like Peter Jackson doing Brain Dead or something like that. His movies do have a lot of gore and a lot of heavy thematic stuff going on in there. So I don't really think of the comedy, but it's true. A lot of his other movies have kind of a comedic or like a blackly comedic bent to them that if you just kind of can take a step back from the gore, kind of funny, but this is not really one of them, at least not intentionally so. I would actually, kind of like argue with Cronenberg that there is some stuff to laugh at in this movie, but I don't know that it's necessarily his intention that I laugh at them, but we're going to get into it. Another interesting thing is that Cronenberg talked about how he came up with this movie while he was going through his own acrimonious divorce with his wife, and it was not going so smoothly. And so you can kind of feel that personal aspect of it in this movie. It really kind of comes through, and I think that's why he says that this movie is more serious than the other movies that he's done. And he also calls it his most true horror movie. I don't know if I'd agree with that necessarily. I'd still put The Fly up there, but The Brood does really feel like a bona fide horror movie. We talked earlier about that, and this is one that I would say is easily considered a horror movie. But it's interesting because it's the family drama stuff that really takes the focal point and makes this movie as compelling as it is. Part of that is led by the actors, in particular Samantha Eggar as the wife, who gives a suitably bizarre and unhinged performance. Really kind of goes for it. She does kind of what I'd call a tour de force performance. She really puts herself out there, and she really even brought something to the table, which is specifically the we'll call it the child licking scene. We'll call it that. It's a very famous part of The Brood. It's something that was kind of controversial when it came out. I think American audiences had that scene trimmed quite a bit, famously, because basically Samantha Eggar's character gives birth and starts licking the newborn as if it were like a cat licking their newborn, and it was apparently very unsettling to people, and so they forced Cronenberg to trim it, which made it actually look like maybe she was eating the newborn, which was even worse. It's just kind of a funny story that Cronenberg likes to tell, and I could see that being the case. I've only seen the uncut version, and that stuff is pretty disturbing. Apparently, that was Samantha Eggar's idea. She came up with that because she had dogs, and she had seen that when a dog gives birth and stuff like that, the mother licks the newborns, licks them clean, and so that was something she came up with, and it's just brilliant. And I got to tip my hat to the actress because that's just a really nice touch, and it became a big famous scene in the movie. I also got to give a shout out to Oliver Reed as the therapist because he's Oliver Reed, man. He's always good. And he's really good here, and he gives a complex performance where you're not really quite sure. Like, he comes off villainous and mysterious and evil, but as the movie goes on, you kind of start to see him a little bit more sympathetically, or maybe your opinion of him maybe kind of lessens. It's an interesting performance from him, and he always gives interesting performances. But I like him in this, and he gives a certain gravitas to this movie that runs the risk of getting a little ridiculous. I said earlier that Cronenberg says he's not, putting his comedy into this, but when you have the Brood attacking people, these little dwarf-like children attacking people, it's kind of unintentionally funny, but it's also unsettling. It rides that line pretty well. Like you're not out and out cracking up about it, but it's also kind of hard to take it seriously. But it also is kind of gruesome and bizarre. And the bizarreness, I think, overcomes the ridiculousness of it to leave the tone of the movie mostly intact. But it's a little bit silly. There's no way to hide that. It really is kind of a silly scene, or scenes. There's more than one. But I love it. I think it adds something to the movie. I think that it's wonderfully Cronenberg again. And it just has this interesting, surprise aspect to it. Like, you just don't see this coming. It's not where you think the movie's going, and it just comes out of nowhere. And that's Cronenberg for you. He just does what you don't think of, and I absolutely love it. This movie seems to have endured pretty well and gotten a lot of critical acclaim. In retrospect, people really like the themes that are being dug into this movie, like, looking at mental illness and controversial therapy, notions of parenthood, and the way that people kind of fears of being parents. There's some interesting stuff it's tackling there. I don't know that it really is successful in sending a clear message, because I don't know that Cronenberg had a clear idea at that time in his life of what he was trying to say in it. And I think that messiness works for the movie. I think that it illustrates the messiness of a divorce and the messiness of your emotions going through that kind of a breakup. So I think the movie echoes that really well. I know that there's also some debate about the misogyny of the movie and how the mother and the wife is is portrayed there, and that is something that Cronenberg gets dinged on from time to time. Is like, this idea of misogyny in his movies, and like this fear of women or women being monstrous, stuff like that, which, it's a debate that we can dig into, I guess, a little bit in the comments. But it really is interesting here because I've seen both sides of the debate. I've seen people talk about this movie being a little bit misogynistic. I've seen people talk about this being, kind of the opposite of that, kind of a commentary on how women are perceived and how they kind of get pushed into these situations where they can't get the kind of care they really need, or they are, vilified for the choices that they make. And it's an interesting debate that, if you're interested, you can kind of dig into this a little bit and you do the research on The Brood. I won't, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here, but it's interesting stuff. The point being that The Brood is giving people like academic discussions to have about it. Like, it really is trying to tackle something deeper. It's not just kind of schlocky, but it does have a schlock funness to it. You don't have to get deep with it to have a good time. And I do have a good time with this movie. I think this movie is great. I really like it. Like I said, it's right up there with some of my favorite Cronenbergs that I haven't already discussed. I would recommend it to anybody who's digging into this kind of stuff. It's a little lighter on the body horror than some of his other stuff, but it's still kind of got some gross stuff. And it's got some, like I said, some heavy themes, some stuff to think about. So think about that if you're going to check it out for the first time. But if you do check it out, let me know what you think. And of course, if you've seen it already, I want to hear your thoughts about it in the comments below too. Offer the counterpoint if you disagree with me. Back me up if you do agree with me. But let's keep that conversation going. And the last Cronenberg movie we're exploring today is Crimes of the Future. Crimes of the Future came out in 2022 and should not be confused with the 1970 film of the same name by David Cronenberg. They have nothing to do with each other. It's not a remake of his earlier film. The plots don't really connect. They are independent movies of each other. They don't have anything to do with each other. I don't really care about any of that because I just like this movie quite a bit. This movie came out fairly recently, and I actually had to kind of reconfigure this subgenre's movies in order to talk about this one because I wanted to talk about it. If you haven't seen it before, the movie takes place in a kind of an alternate or near future where human evolution has accelerated quite a bit and people are no longer feeling pain the same way, and they sometimes their bodies create spontaneous organs, and it's all very strange, and the government is trying to kind of regulate this in order to kind of keep this evolution idea in check. Meanwhile, the idea of like surgical procedures being done in public as performance art has become the new big thing. And we follow this couple that does performance art while they are approached by the government and by kind of this revolution faction, if you will, and well, hijinks abound. Frankly, let's just stop there and try to figure out what is going on in this movie, because it's not the clearest movie in the world, but it is interesting and there's enough to understand, but you don't have to get too bogged down in the nuts and bolts of it, and you can just enjoy the ride. And enjoy the ride I do. This is, to me, a movie of David Cronenberg kind of getting back to form. The last few years, he's been a little bit quiet. And when he has made movies, it hasn't really been the Cronenberg style. It hasn't been the body horror, sexy, contemplative fusion of technology and physiology. It hasn't been Cronenberg to me. But this movie really feels like him getting back to those roots. In particular, not just body horror, but also tying that body horror to like sexiness, to sexuality. It really is on full force in this movie to its benefit. It really, does feel like that Cronenberg thing again, where he is showing that repulsion and attraction at the same time and just kind of balancing that out really well. So you've got these horrific things like, wounds in people that are a turn on. And it's actually very expressed in this movie. One of the major like plot points and themes in this movie is how old sex, as they call it, is kind of out. People don't really engage in that now. And the new sex is this like body modification, body disfigurement, surgical procedure stuff. That is how people are getting off in this world. And that's absolutely fascinating because it quite literally is just David Cronenberg making his own little fetish, if you will, like the norm. He's giving you a world where his kind of fetishism is the norm. And it's a wild world to be dropped into. And I'd say that it would be disorienting and kind of hard to get into, but I think that the actors do a really good job of anchoring this movie and letting you connect to it in a way that you really shouldn't be able to, because this is such a bizarre and strange and foreign world that you really shouldn't be able to connect to it. But I'll credit the actors, namely Viggo Mortensen as the lead guy, but Lea Seydoux is his as his girlfriend, as you like your anchors. They're the ones kind of holding this together. I also got to mention my girl Kristen Stewart, because I love me some Kristen Stewart. She's got a small noteworthy role here that I absolutely love her in this, because she really is kind of in a way like a neophyte Cronenberg. She is fascinated by this world and kind of the allure of it. She's drawn to it, and it kind of is an interesting thing because her character is supposed to be kind of helping regulate this, but she's also really into it. And it's kind of like almost like the audience, like you're really kind of supposed to be repulsed by this, but there's also a sexiness to it that is hard to ignore, and it works really, really well. Cronenberg, again, writing that line and writing it like he always has. Mortensen gives a really interesting performance as this kind of sickly guy whose body creates new organs, and he's kind of a star in this performance art field because his wife, played by Lea Seydoux, does the surgeries on him for everybody to watch. And those scenes are great with everybody with their cameras filming it and stuff. It's wild stuff. It really is imaginative. Once again, Cronenberg doing his thing where he's creating not only a world where everything is fascinated with this body horror stuff, but also strange devices that are kind of enacting this body horror. Lea Seydoux's character uses like these devices, like this medical bed and this like remote controlled surgical instrument stuff, that she's almost like she's playing an instrument that's doing this surgery. It's fascinating stuff. And the way that these surgical wounds and the stuff like that become like sexual triggers is gross and fascinating and awesome. Like I said, it's Cronenberg doing his Cronenberg best, and it really hit the sweet spot for me. I was surprised because the movie got a lot of good critical acclaim. Like if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it scores rather high, and maybe it's just Cronenberg's reputation finally giving him some love. But I was surprised it was as well received as it is, because it's a really weird movie. Like plot wise, it's a little hard to follow, though not so hard to follow that I think it leaves you in the dust. It's a complicated movie because they're setting up a whole world that you don't really fully understand, and they've got a lot of stuff going on in there. But I was surprised that people rolled with it as much as they did, especially because that off-putting combination of sex and body horror is one that's not really easy for people to get along with. But the critics loved it. But it seems like it's a divisive movie amongst fans. I've talked to a few people who've seen it, and some people really liked it. Some people, kind of shrugging their shoulders, kind of meh about it, over it. And I'm talking Cronenberg fans who didn't really care for it. So I don't really know what that's about. Like, I really, really like this movie, but I'm apparently a little bit in the minority on this. Maybe, I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments about it, especially if you're a Cronenberg fan. How did you feel about this movie? Because I think it's a return to form. I think it hits the sweet spot. In fact, I don't think it's just a return to form. I think it's one of his better movies. Like, I'm not really ready to say that it's going to beat some of his top movies, some of his best, some of my favorites. But I do think it can go toe-to-toe with one of them. Like, I can see this being the logical extension of Existenz, one of my favorite Cronenberg movies. It's not as good as that in my opinion, but it really kind of flows from the same kind of concept, especially the tying of the body horror and the sexuality of it, the eroticism of it, really kind of comes through in this movie. And I really, again, I like the performances. And we were talking earlier about Rabin and his early kind of work looking a little bit rough. This movie looks very polished, looks very good. It looks very slick. It's still using enough of the practical effects to really be effective and give it that visceral, like tangible, gross feel to it. I don't know. I really liked this movie. I really liked the way it came out. So I'm curious to see what you guys think, especially if you haven't seen it. Check it out. Let me know if I'm being overly enthusiastic about it or if I'm overselling it. But I'm really curious to see what other people think about Crimes of the Future, because I am a big fan. So that's going to do it for our exploration into Cronenberg. But if you like Cronenberg movies like I do, we've got a few extra credits to talk about because there's so many good movies to talk about. So the first one we're going to look at is a movie called Shivers. Shivers came out in 1975, and I did mention it earlier in the video because it is a movie that came out before Rabid, but has somewhat of a similar concept or a similar theme or plot to it. But it is, enough difference to warrant there being two different movies to talk about. But it is an interesting one to talk about on its own merits. And I don't like it as much as Rabid, but we're going to get into all that in just a second. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about these doctors that have created these like parasitic organs that would take the place of regular organs, and one of them actually unleashes this on a girl in an apartment building, and it winds up going kind of creating this epidemic that this like outbreak that takes over the entire apartment building and then starts infecting everybody. And the people who get infected by these parasites, these they kind of crawl around and insert themselves into you. They wind up going kind of sex crazed and start having these rage filled attacks where they either like violently attack people or sexually assault them, and that spreads the disease, and creates this crazy outbreak, and hijinks abound, and they're very disturbing hijinks at that. But we'll stop there, of course. But you can see from that description how it sounds similar to Rabbit in terms of this outbreak happening and the sexuality aspect of it. Again, early Cronenberg really hammering down that body horror meets sexuality aspect to it that frankly I love. I think it's just great stuff. It's really unsettling and gross and alluring at the same time, and I love it. But it's rough here. It's rough here in part because, again, early Cronenberg, so the filmmaking technique isn't refined yet. By his own admission, he didn't exactly know what he was doing yet, but it's still good. It's still good, and the gross stuff's still gross, and it's still wildly imaginative, and all the stuff you want from a Cronenberg film. It just isn't super polished yet. But I'm willing to forgive all that, especially because the actors, by and large, are doing a pretty good job with what is admittedly somewhat ridiculous material. I do like the performances being given here, and it's enough to keep the movie feeling watchable, not more than watchable even. Like, it's just, the stuff that's maybe not 100% great in the movie, you can kind of forgive it because the stuff that is working really, really well. I do think it works better in Rabbit. I think in Rabbit he's polished up a little bit more than he is here. And it's interesting that you kind of tread the same themes, the same concept. I guess he felt like he had more to say on there, but I don't really know that Rabbit says any more than Shivers does about this. Shivers is interesting because I guess, and I forget who the name of the writer was, but he worked with a couple different people on this. And one of the ideas about this was that it would rebuke kind of like the 50s era kind of patriarchal, bland conservatism stuff there, and kind of lean into like this 60s and 70s free love type stuff. But what it really winds up doing is showing a lot of sexual assault and stuff like that. So it's a muddy message at best, and a kind of an uncomfortable movie when you see some of the stuff happening in there and the attacks and stuff like that. This one's kind of a trigger warning movie, I guess. Think about it before you watch it. But it is an interesting one. It's not one of my favorite Cronenbergs. It's probably towards the bottom of the list for me of the movies of his I've seen. But it's interesting because you do see again the origins of Cronenberg's style and his interests in this movie, and it's definitely worth watching. It's not a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination. It's a little bit rough, a little bit unpolished, and I think Rabbit is a better version of the same kind of themes, told a little bit more interestingly, and with maybe a little bit more nuance, a little bit more to say, a little bit more. But Shiver's still worth your time if you haven't seen it. It is interesting because it was a bit of a hit. It was a commercial hit when it came out to a degree, but it was also panned by the critics. And nowadays, I think it's got a little bit more of a reputation just because Cronenberg's got a little bit more of a reputation, but it still isn't considered to be one of his best, from what I understand of it. And again, I think Rabbit is the better of the two. But if you haven't seen it and you like Cronenberg, you should check this one out. It is one of his first films. I don't think it's his first it's not his first film for sure. It might be his first commercially commercially pushed movie, commercially made commercially available. But I'd have to go back and look at the research on that to confirm that. But it's definitely an interesting take on what Cronenberg's career would become. So it's definitely worth checking out for that reason alone. The next extra credit movie we're going to talk about is Scanners. Scanners came out in 1981 and is a movie it's a movie I moved off the list to put Crimes of the Future on there, honestly. Scanners was going to be the third movie that we talked about, but I bumped it. And in part because it's really more sci-fi than horror. I mean, it really is, even I have to admit that. And in part because I think part of my affection for Scanners is driven by nostalgia, but I'm going to explain that in just a little bit. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a company that is trying to use these people that are psychic called scanners to basically kind of use them to fuel their business of military weaponry type stuff, and to kind of quell this revolution of rogue scanners that are basically trying to combat this company and stop them from doing what they're doing. And the rogue scanners are led by Michael Ironside as kind of revolutionary, and hijinks abound as this confrontation kind of comes to a head, no pun intended. But I'll stop there so not to spoil it for you. And it's a little overly complicated, if I'm being honest. The story is got a little bit of this kind of political and like corporate intrigue to it, which as a kid I didn't really follow that too much because I was really more interested in the psychic power aspect of this, and mostly into the head explosion scene. The head explosion scene is, if you know anything about scanners, it's that. That scene is insane where Michael Ironside uses his psychic powers to explode somebody's head on camera, and it looks so awesome. It looks so gross and so real. It's shocking. And as a kid, it blew my mind, no pun intended again. It blew my mind. It really did. And it seared into my memory. And I loved it. I loved that movie. And I loved the movie as a result, even though the rest of the movie does not really live up to that scene. There's some other kind of minor gore stuff in there, but nothing ever comes to that level ever again. But I still find it fascinating. The idea behind people being able to blow up your head with their mind was fascinating to me. Even though watching it now as an adult and just seeing people kind of go like, like Professor X or whatever, it's kind of ridiculous now. It doesn't really. It's a little laughable now, and that's why I say the nostalgia kind of comes into it. Is like as a kid, I remember really loving this movie, and as an adult, I like this movie. I don't love it the way I used to love it because, there are parts that drag a little bit. There are parts that just a little kind of tongue in cheek. And again, I think Cronenberg kind of knew that. I kind of think he goes for that a little bit. And just kind of having a little bit of fun with the kind of slightly camp aspect of it, and it works. You know what? It's a fun movie. It's an interesting movie. The corporate intrigue stuff is probably not as deep or as interesting as it could or should be. It's certainly not on the level of something like Crimes of the Future, but it really is enough to drive the plot along. I do wish there was more hijinks, though. I wish there was more stuff that was kind of on par with that head explosion, because I do think that that's a highlight of the movie. The other highlight of the movie, of course, is Michael Ironside, who is chewing scenery and just great in this movie. He's got an intensity to him, but he's also got a charm that just works in this movie. And unfortunately, he's not really the lead. The lead guy, in my opinion, is a little bit bland. He's not nearly as interesting as Ironside. And so I do think that Michael Ironside is a big part of why the movie does float. It does work. And it's just not. I wish he was the main guy more. I wish you could see more of him. But what you do get is really, really good. Unfortunately, I think that the movie itself is maybe trying to do too many things. There's this whole plot or subplot really about how the scanners got made and the scientific experiments. And I guess there's some, I don't know if it's intentional, if it's just kind of people have drawn this connection, but there's these thalidomide experiments in the late 50s, early 60s, where pregnant women were given this medication, and it created all these birth defects. And there seems to be a strong allegory or correlation between that real life event and what happens in scanners, or what has happened in scanners. And that's interesting. That's some interesting stuff, but that kind of comes late in the game, and it isn't really super duper explored or dwelled upon as much, because it kind of goes into psychic battles instead. And I guess I kind of wish it picked a lane a little bit. Like, I wish that it was either just crazy psychic power battles with like gore and silliness, or it was really kind of delving into this social issue of like experimentation gone wrong, and the ethics of that. And it kind of does both, and it doesn't do either of them nearly as much as I would like it to. So it kind of straddles the line in a way that isn't as satisfying as I remember it being as a kid. And I'm kind of surprised as a kid I liked this so much, but I think that head explosion has some mileage, man. It really does work. And I know Scanners has a couple sequels. I haven't even bothered to check them out because I don't think anything more really needs to be said. Like I said, if I wanted to see this done either more campy and fun gore, or more interesting paranoia and mystery, I would want to see it done by Cronenberg, and the sequels aren't him. So less interested in that. But if you've seen the sequels, I would be interested in letting me know in the comments what you think of them. Are they good? Are they worth the time? Do they hold up to the original? I'm guessing they don't. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this movie, because I saw this as a kid. Revisiting it as an adult, I was less enamored of it as I was as a kid. How did you feel about it? And when did you see it? Did you come to it as an adult? Did you see it as a child? I'd like to know all that in the comments below, because Scanners is one that I was kind of surprised when I revisited it that I didn't have the same affection for it. But I still think it's definitely good, definitely worth your time, definitely worth checking out, and has a lot of interesting things to discuss. So let's keep discussing that in the comments below. And the last extra credit movie I'm going to talk about is Dead Ringers. Dead Ringers came out in 1988, and this one had a little bit of the opposite effect as Scanners did for me because I saw this one when it came out too, and I was younger, and I felt a little disappointed when I first watched it. But then when I revisited it and I got a little older, I loved it that much more. So this is an interesting one that kind of switches that up a little bit because it is a disturbing movie based more on like the themes and the ideas and what's going on rather than the actual body gore itself, although it's got its moments there too. But we're going to go into all that in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is the story about twin gynecologists who are really kind of codependent on each other and live their lives together, and they wind up having these relationships with women where they kind of basically both are involved with them, and sometimes they don't know that they're both involved in it. And they come across this one woman in particular who's got a drug issue, and she kind of throws a wrench into their perfectly symmetrical and shared existence. And hijinks abound as they tend to do. And the hijinks in this one are the implications of those hijinks are at least are really really disturbing and really out there. This movie is a trip of a movie, and the biggest trip about it is that it's actually inspired by a real life story about these twin gynecologists that Cronenberg read about in some magazines and then read a book about. And I guess the book is a fictionalized account of these two guys, these two twins' lives. And Cronenberg kind of takes and adapts the book to a degree, and then kind of does his own thing. But what's really shocking is that the way that the movie ends, which I will not spoil, is the way, or at least aligns with the way that the real life story ends. And that's strange and tragic because the ending of this movie is unsettling and bizarre and weird. And it's actually not, well, it's not real. It's very similar to reality. And that shocked me when I found that out because it's wild, man. Like the movie starts out with just this kind of general creepy unsettlingness of these two gynecologists that just kind of share everything and they live together and they're like inappropriately connected at the hip. You know what I mean? They don't live separately. They don't have their own separate lives. They're very codependent, very like symbiotic. And it's just kind of a weird, unsettling, and off-putting thing. And then as the movie goes on, it starts going crazy. And then the second half of the movie gets really, really bizarre and things get really, really dark and kind of gross. And this the idea of like this drug-addled descent into madness, and this guy hiring an artist to create these very bizarre, almost alien-looking surgical devices for gynecological devices that just look like torture devices. Like just seeing the devices themselves is horrific. It's really just like letting your mind do what your mind does, seeing something like that. It really is affecting. This is the kind of thing that when I was younger watching it, I was expecting to see crazy gore and just kind of to be more of a straight horror film and scary. And it really is the off-putting nature and the horrific aspect of what is being implied by this movie that is its strength. And I couldn't appreciate that till I got a little bit older because it's gross, man. Like this idea of what these guys are doing is gross. The way they manipulate these women and what they do to them, and frankly the sexual assault of them is disgusting and gross. And then the when it goes into the full on David Cronenberg aspect of it, and like showing some of the body horror glimpses and showing these instruments and showing like this descent into like just insanity and this codependency that is just overwhelming is fantastic. And it's fantastic in large part because of Jeremy Irons, who plays both of the doctors. He's doing a dual role and he's crushing it. He's crushing it so hard because you can take one look at him and know which one you're talking about. Like they don't really, they feel like distinct characters. They don't feel like the same person playing two different characters. They feel like two distinct characters. Irons is great. He's doing just enough of a balance between being really strange and also being somewhat charming that you don't like totally push him away, but you also never fully embrace him. It really is a wonderful performance, a nuanced performance. And it really is like, again, the kind of the anchor of this movie. He is awesome in this. I guess he wasn't even the first or even the second choice, but thank God he got the role because he nails it. He nails it, and he is both creepy and charming at the same time. And it really is interesting to watch this kind of strange pairing of these two brothers and how they're just not good for each other, but they also kind of need each other, and then watching it all fall apart. It's going to go bad, but you don't know how it's going to go bad. And it just goes so bizarre and then so tragic that it's just very, very satisfying. It's a great movie. It's one that every time I watch it, I feel like I get a little bit more out of it. I get a little bit more interested in it. And apparently, I'm not alone, because I guess they've just recently done a TV version of this, like a TV miniseries or a show. I'm not sure if it's a full show, like an ongoing show, if it's a miniseries, because I haven't seen it yet. It's got Rachel Weisz, who I like, playing the Jeremy Irons role. So I'm intrigued by that. I just haven't got a chance to check it out yet. And I haven't really heard if it's good or not. So if you've seen it, let me know. But I'm intrigued to check it out because, like I said, revisiting this material, I'm more into it now than I was when I was younger, when it first came out. And I just wanted kind of the thrill and the gores and the horror. And now I'm just kind of really put off by the uncomfortableness of the whole thing. It really is effective for me. Is it effective for you too? If you've seen it, let me know. And again, let me know about the TV show as well. But if you haven't seen this one is a really good one. Again, maybe check out and see if some of this stuff is a little bit off-putting for you. Maybe it's a little bit trigger warning-y. I don't know. But it's definitely one that I would recommend for Cronenberg fans, because it is one of his more mature and interesting ones that has something interesting to say. And the fact that it's based on real life is all the more chilling and bizarre. So that's going to do it for our look at Cronenberg. I have been looking forward to doing this for some time now, and I'm convinced that as a result of this video, when we revisit the top horror directors from the horror movie syllabus, Cronenberg's going to do a much better showing now, because we're talking about a lot of his movies, but he deserves it. He's an incredible director, wildly imaginative, really, controversial, but with like with an intent, or with a message, or with a reason for doing what he's doing. He's trying to create something new and artistic and challenging, and I think he's usually very successful. Love it, love the guy, love his work, and happy to talk about more in the comments below. But right now we're going to talk about Horror Trivia Pursuit. It's that time where I look at a Horror Trivia Pursuit card and try to answer it on camera and see if I can do it without cutting and not embarrass myself. We're going to look at the gore category on the card, because Cronenberg. And the question is this: what actress was both in the Planet Terror and Death Proof segments of 2007's Grindhouse? And I know this one. I know this one really easily, and I'd swear we just talked about Grindhouse recently. I can't remember why we were talking about it, but we talked about Grindhouse recently, or at least I feel like we did, and I can't remember why. But so this is already kind of on my mind. But I do know the answer to this. I actually really enjoyed Grindhouse. I saw it in the theater, and I do think the best way to see it is with all together with the fake trailers and the whole bit. For those of you that don't know, Quentin Tarantino did one of the movies, and Robert Rodriguez did the other one. He did Planet Terror, and then Tarantino did Death Proof. And they're both fun movies. Neither of them are the best movies for the directors. They're both campy good times. They're Grindhouse movies. They're homages. In some cases, they are a little more on the nose, and they should be, but they're fun. They're fun movies, and I enjoy them. And I enjoy the performances because everybody knew what they were making at these movies. They knew they were having a good time. They knew they're not taking themselves seriously. And this actress in particular did a really great job of both of those, in particular in Planet Terror. And I'm going to stop giving clues on that one because I'm kind of rambling to give you that time, of course. But time to wrap it up because I know my answer, and I'm like 99% sure that I've got this one right. So go ahead and lock your answer in. I'm going to give my answer. My answer is Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan, who is probably most memorable from Planet Terror with the machine gun leg, but really it gives a great performance in both. And I am pretty sure that I'm right on this one, but let's just check the card to make sure. And it is Rose McGowan. It is Rose McGowan. I was right on that one. And be curious to know what you said if you didn't get it right. But my guess is a lot of you, if you've seen it, you probably guessed Rose McGowan as well. It's not that hard of a question if you've seen the movie. And if you didn't, you might have just been taking a shot in the dark. Maybe you said Uma Thurman. That would be a pretty good guess, honestly. But it would be wrong. But hopefully you got it right. Hopefully you liked Cronenberg. Hopefully you liked talking about Cronenberg. Hopefully you liked the movies we picked. And if you've got your own movies that you think should have been on here, let me know in the comments below. But until next week, when we do something completely different, I'm just going to say, class dismissed.